30 days from when the new one comes.
Like I like my coffee maker. Why would you mess with my device?
I won't walk into the screen.
Okay. That's not illegal. That's just
The topic is the Baal Teshuva. The Baal Teshuva. If we would take the topic of Teshuva itself, it would be so endless that there would be no way to even get started. Because Teshuva says that when Hashem tried to create the world, the Medrash says it wouldn't last until Hashem created Teshuva, which means that part of the human condition is that you don't learn how to walk without falling down. It's a necessary thing for the existence of the human race. We don't get everything right every time. But the Baal Teshuva is a personality. Let's start with this. We say in the davening on Yom HaNorah, Ki loisach boitz b'mois hames. Hashem has no interest in a person dying. Kim b'shuva b'darku b'chaya. He just wants a person to be a Baal Teshuva. He wants you to do tshuva. V'ad yom moso tichakelo im toshuv miyad tekamu. Until the day that a person dies, Hashem is sitting there waiting for them to do tshuva, and He will openly and immediately accept them. There's nobody that He's too mad at. And we have people that we're not interested in them doing tshuva. I like hating them. A person could have that.
Like murder, you can't come back from that.
You can absolutely. There's nothing that you cannot do tshuva for. Our tradition, and this is not about a Jew who became a Baal Teshuva, but our tradition has this famous story of Nebuzaradan, the executioner, who was killing people like a concentration camp, like running the ovens for Nebuchadnezzar. He was slaughtering people, and he did tshuva, Jews, and his tshuva was accepted. And I don't understand it. It's part of our tradition. It's something that I've struggled with to make any sense out of, and I don't feel like I have any personal clarity on how a person can murder thousands of children or something and do tshuva. I'll just tell you a couple other short things about this. It says there's a chazal that Paro did tshuva on some level, and that's why he was saved and brought to Nineveh. It says in the Bible, this is worth picking up on just where we start, that it says that the arubos hashamayim niftachu. It says on the day of the Mabul, the windows of the heaven opened. So a simple interpretation is it was going to rain a lot, right? It's like an imagery of the heavens opening up. But the problem is that in Sefer Malachi, it's a famous pasuk, Hashem promises, I'm going to open up the windows of the heaven for you, and send you blessing without any limit. So now we have a problem. The Arubas Hashamayim is these two places only in Tanakh. In one place, it's talking about a flood that's going to destroy the human race. And another place talking about an endless bracha. So what are these windows opening up, right? So says the Imrei Emes of Ger. He said that the Arubas Hashamayim means that they opened up because God was waiting for them to do tshuva. And at that moment, it was especially, that's what we say in davening, Hakel haposeach b'chol yom dalsos Hashem opens up the windows of the heaven. That means that at the moment of the Mabul, God was waiting for those people to do tshuva. You are not as bad as anyone in the Mabul.
Wasn't that also part of their process? Now they thought the sun rose, they went underneath the earth and came out the window on the other side. This is also like a scientific understanding.
Yes, it could be. There's different opinions in Chazal of how it works, and that's one of the Gemaras where it says, I think the Goyim have it right, and not us. But in other words, the idea of the windows of the heaven opening in the pasuk being used in two places, says the Imrei Emes, is saying that God was waiting for them to do tshuva. What I'm taking out of that is, what did you do already in your life? The Mabul was so bad that God was willing to get rid of the whole human race, basically, because of this. You did something so horrible, and at that moment, all He wanted was that they should do tshuva. All He wanted is that they should do tshuva. That's the... Okay. So, there's also a pasuk that we read this time of year. Shabbos Shuvah, we're going to read the pasuk. We read it really on the fast days. We just read it, rather. Dirshu Hashem behimatzo, kira'u be'yosef karav. Seek Hashem when He's found, and call to Him when He's close. So we're used to saying that's Rosh Hashanah and Kippur, that's when God's close, and that's absolutely true. However, if you look at the Targum says, seek God ad da'atun chayim, when He's available. It means when you're alive. And call to Him when He's close means as long as you're still in existence. Ad da'atun kayamin. So, you hear that? God is available and close as long as you're alive. You can do tshuva at any second. That pasuk is talking about Tshuva. So this is accessible. It's available. Okay. Says the Rambam in the laws of Mamrim. Mamrim means people who trade in their religion. A mummer is a person who gives up Judaism. Lahamir, right? Hamarat Ksafim is trading in. So in Hilchos Mamrim, he says like this. He's talking about who's an apikoros and who's a mummer. And he describes them. And then he says, however, that's only the people that make these choices and make these bad mistakes. They have a halacha to be called a mummer, and they become an enemy of the state. And if they're dying, you don't save their life, and this type of thing. Avol, b'nei hatolam ha'ela, the children of these people who are raised now as non-believing Jews, uvnei b'nei, and the grandchildren, shehidicha osam avosam, who were just pushed away from Judaism by their ancestors, the noldu ben hakaroim, and were raised by the Karaites. So in the Rambam's day, that was the Reform movement, was the Karaites. They did not accept the Torah Sheba'al Peh, they didn't do Shabbos and Yom Kippur and everything correctly, and they denied the basic principles of Torah. So he says, Harehu katinuk shenishba beinehem. Such a person is like a kidnapped child, they're not responsible. Ve'eno Zor is that mummer comes from the word lehamir, which means to trade in, and therefore it's like a trader, a person who traded in their religion for other set of beliefs. So in our context, it's like another word that's used together with apikores and other things like that. And because they were raised by these people, harehu ka'ones, even if the person later finds out I'm a Jew, and he sees Jews around him, so he knows there's such a thing as Torah, there's such a thing as Jews, and he knows he's one of them. He should probably explore this, get on the internet, find something out. Even so, says the Rambam, he says, don't be so quick to kill them, and instead, roi lachzirin b'tshuva, a person should try to help them do tshuva, ulamashchan b'divrei shalom, and should bring them in with words of peace, ad she yachzeru le'etan haTorah, till they come back to the strong, Torah lifestyle. So this group of people that are not responsible, it wasn't a choice they made, then it becomes our responsibility to pull them in with love. So the Rambam already describes this concept of lahachziron b'tshuva. This is, as far as I know, in the Rishonim, one of the strongest sources for the obligation of kiruv. And basically it says that if somebody cannot be written off as malicious, if they are malicious, then sometimes you have to fight with them, and you have to attack them directly. But when a person is not that way, they're just misguided, then we have a mitzvah to pull them back in. And in fact, this was a major issue in the times of the Rambam. The Karaites were very strong. A couple hundred years before him. At times the Gaonim, the Karaites was a strong movement. They've survived until today. There are Karaites in Israel, significant numbers of them, and when you Google it, you'll find. So the Karaites are right. I've heard that Santa Clarita, maybe right. They're like up in Northern California. There's a group also. They have like a little shul, and they won't call it Pesach. They'll call it Chag Hamatzot, because they only want to go. They won't go with any rabbinic names for anything.
Malicious meaning they know everything.
So there were people that had access to Torah, that access to mitzvahs, and were fighting an ideological battle against. So the difference might be like from a reformer in the mid 1700s, early 1800s, who was had learned Torah with Rav Hirsch and was now fighting a battle against orthodoxy, as opposed to someone who's raised in LA. Going to a temple once a year, like they're totally not ideologically in the same space as someone might have been who was considered in the old days.
So even now, it sounds like Karaites would be under that level, because it sounds like how you're referencing is that someone who's raised in the authentic rabbinic tradition that then rejects it, and then their children are children that are.
Right. It would seem that this might still apply to Karaites. Someone asked Rav Yosef, we'll get to Tshuva about this. Someone asked Rav Yosef this question, because in Israel there really are Karaites who don't do, they ask him, they don't do Shabbat right, they don't do Yom Kippur, they don't do this, they don't do that. What's a story? Okay, to the point that so many people who were Karaim were starting to come back, that we'll see, that there became something that we'll see in a minute called like a process, almost a conversion process, for people who wanted to come back and join the Jewish people from other movements.
How could we be assured that they're even Jewish if they didn't keep Torah so egregiously, right? 3, 4, 5, 20 generations. I mean, how do you even know if they're Jewish anymore?
Right, that's true. And if you have no way to know, you have no way to know. We'd have to know. We'd have to know. In other words, right now, sometimes you can know. You can see the person's grandmother's grave, but the Ethiopians is in a way it's a different subject, but according to Rav Ovadia, it's the same subject because he considers them from Shevet Dan, and therefore they're Baal Teshuva. But he's a minority. He's really the only one.
He's the only one.
And,
More than a minority. Like he stands alone.
Yeah, everyone else says that they're out of conference.
Right.
Which is really helpful for them, because they didn't have gittin
Right.
that were good, so they should all be mamzerim. Except Rav Ovadia says they didn't have kosher kedushin either, so there's no marriages, which is like, but they're Jewish.
Even though half of them in Israel have crosses tattooed on their faces.
Really, face tattoo is a big step.
Like
Wow.
tribal facial tattoos.
Aaron Carter, like all the way, half of them are
At least
crosses.
the state of Israel, don't they say the Jewish haven't chosen if they're Jewish? Because who would want to be a Jew?
So there is such a thing in the Gemara that it actually doesn't apply for everything. Right, in the Gemara there is such a thing, but it's not, and even in Shulchan Aruch, it's not 100% across the board. Like, if a person shows up and they've been living in your town as a Jew for a long time, and they have that kind of thing, but if a person just shows up to marry a girl,
Like the Karaites have been there for.
so the minute that they have any other motivation, it's not for sure true, because, right, tzedakah, like they know if they go outside Glatmar, you get a lot more. If you can just learn the
Neil
name of
Tzedakah,
Neil,
Neil
right, that's right.
Tzedakah.
So here it says like this. In the first time, as far as I'm aware, that there was a big Baal Teshuva movement, I don't know how big it was, but it was a big enough phenomena that they needed to develop methodologies, was the Karaites. So the Karaites do not quite go back to the Tzedukim and the Baitusim of the times of the Gemara, but they were sort of considered spiritually their heirs. So in other words, there were always people that were sort of fighting and having splinter groups in all different times, to the point that someone might say that today the Reformers are another example of this, even though they're not necessarily the same families, the same people, right? Then a movement that came 200 years before that or whatever. So it says in Shulchan Aruch the following.
What year are we talking, just for context over there?
So the Rambam was in the 1100s.
Right. Oh, this took place during
And
Rambam.
in the Rambam's time already, he's saying that you have all these Karaites around, and they don't know what they're talking about. They just kind of do what their parents told them to do. So be nice to them and try to pull them in. At a certain point, within a couple hundred years, people start to get really frustrated with them and say the Rambam doesn't apply anymore. These people are very difficult, and like they refuse, like they really refuse everything, and they're not. It says in Shulchan Aruch over here the following at the very end of the laws of Gerus. It says Yisrael Mummer Sha'asa Tshuva. If you have a Jew who is a mummer, that means he converted to another way of either another religion, that's nishtamed, or he's like a real atheist. I mean, but in the old days, you didn't have that so much. It usually was that they were buying into some other ideology. Ein tzarich litbol. He doesn't have to go to the mikveh like a convert. Rak midrabanan yesh lo litbol, but rabbinically he has to. Ulekabel alav divrei chaverut bifnei gimel, and he has to accept upon himself divrei chaverus in front of 3 people. He goes through like a rabbinic conversion ceremony in front of 3 people. Now, the question is, what's the ceremony? Right. What do we do? So the first thing is, right, the Pischei Tshuva says, and the Pischei Tshuva talks about, he brings on the Rashbash, right, who was in the times after the Spanish Inquisition. So he says, the Anusim, the Conversos, the Moranos, Kishabon Lachsa B'Tshuva, when they come back, Ein lahodia mixas kaos chamuros. Don't start telling them things. Don't make it difficult for them. Don't treat it like a conversion. You have to pull them in, the chesed, and they won't necessarily even need tvila. Ein tzarich tvila. He says, like, for the Moranos, don't do this. It's going to push them away too much. He gives a special prayer that you should say when you do their bris milah. Hatzlach na le'evan anikra shemo kach. Historically, and this is very, very interesting, the people who were raised as conversos did not want to become Jewish afterwards. When they would move to Amsterdam with their families, and the early 1500s, kid is born in Portugal or something, with a Christian name. Parents will still light candles in the basement and do these other things. And now, you see this historically, there's a lot of this. They would
These
move
are
to...
kids of Marana?
Kids, right. These kids are raised going to church every Sunday, knowing there's some weird thing about them that they're Jewish, but they can't tell anyone because you'll be killed, and this type of thing. When those parents who would make it to the New World, to Amsterdam, to these other places, the parents would go right into being Jewish. And the children and grandchildren did not want to at all. It took an enormous... They didn't recognize these songs, they didn't recognize these rituals, these foods. The whole thing was not... They didn't feel Jewish. They knew something was funny about them. And that's a very interesting thing that over the years I've read about. So it's very, very interesting how he's saying that these people need an enormous... Halacha says, forget this. Forget putting them in the mikveh. It's derabbanan, and it's a good idea, but just get them back, because whatever you can do to relax it. Similarly, there's a concept that a convert would shave every single hair on his body. And the Ashkenazi conversions would ideally want a person to shave every hair on their body for a couple different reasons. Either so that there's no chatzitza in the mikveh, but that's a little much with the eyebrows, right? And right. So some say to be very careful with chatzitza is to shave every single hair. But another reason is because the Levium, when they were inaugurated, it was like a matter of purity, and the idea is this person has been living as if he's going to get a fresh, cue ball, clean start, and he's going to look like a bizarre guy. Now the problem is, what about women? What about people with dreadlocks? But it's like all interesting questions that are brought in the halacha. The Sfardim were never machmir on this. They weren't so careful about this. They said, listen, even among Ashkenazim, the poskim say that for a woman who says I'm going to be embarrassed, or a man, someone says it's going to be too embarrassing, whatever, it's not an absolute requirement. And that's why you don't really see it so much. You don't see that guy suddenly show up completely bald. However, an interesting thing is that the poskim discuss that ideally, some say that it would be a good idea to do also for a Baal Teshuva who's coming back for real, and it could be that there's certainly more room to be lenient on it here than elsewhere. So it's like the Rashbash saying,
So
like,
what's the purpose of it? Because he's not accomplishing
purity,
anything.
right? Also, if you're a goy, you're allowed to shave your payas and your beard all the way down. If you're a Jew, you can't do that.
Right.
Why would he be allowed to do that? It's very tricky.
Right.
And yet it's saying that he could.
No, but he's still
That's
a
for a
Jew.
convert.
But if you're talking about a yid who's a mummer who's chayzer b'tshuva,
Right.
and they seem to be saying that you would do everything, including the payas and the beard. So one reason that's brought in Rishonim already is because of the Levium. When the Levium were inaugurated, they had every single hair on their body shaved.
Yeah, but outside of
And
this-
it represented like a rededication to something, and shaving off all the tumah and getting a fresh start. And it's something it's literally brought in Shulchan Aruch, legaleach saira, and they have to figure out, does it mean all the way down? Does it not mean all the way down? Does it just mean a haircut?
Why don't you just let him grow it out for 6 months and call him a nuzzer and call it a day? You could do the other way of dedicating an experience by saying, I'm going to refrain from drinking, I'm going to refrain from cutting my
Why
hair.
not have a person grow his hair?
Yeah, I'm saying instead of cutting it down as a rededication, you could say nuzzers are also a dedication to Hashem.
Right.
So you
Yeah.
can go the other way too, right?
Or you could ask this question on the Nazir. Why does the Torah not have a Nazir shave his head instead of growing his hair? We could,
And like, if you want
yeah.
a dedication to an activity, you could do it
yeah,
without
it's
the
interesting
spirit.
how it's connected to the Levium, his inauguration, and the concepts of hair. And
Naziris is much more than that.
right, Naziris is a different thing a
So
little
let's back
bit.
to the
It's,
issue with the hair, because you're not allowed to...
yeah, so
shave your-
that's something I'm mystified about, and I just don't understand how that would work. I'll have a suggestion later, maybe based on some of the things we're going to learn. But one interesting thing is like this. I'll just tell you about one interesting person. There was a guy named Profiat Duran. He was called the Ephodi. The Ephodi, if you open up a Rambam Moreh Nevuchim, there's a pirush on the bottom from the Ephodi. He lived in the 1300s. He was raised as a Marano. And he figured out, he started learning kind of on his own and wrote a sefer called Maisa Ephod. And he's an important, like, Torah personality. But he did one very interesting thing. His Christian name was Honoratus de Bonafide, because they gave him that was his Christian name. They gave him, against his will, they gave him a baptism, and now we have his name in the records. So listen to this. In 1396, he wrote, so when did he live until? He lived 1350 to 1415. 1396 in Spain, he wrote a work that's unbelievable. It's called Al Tihi Ka'avosecha. Don't be like your ancestors. And it was understood by the Christians to be a work trying to convince Jews to convert to Christianity. But in fact, it was a satire. Come join the Christians. It's great. We don't use our brains. It was like that. I'll read you something. I translated something I went to the first piece in the Sefer, and it took them 2 years that they were publishing it and giving it out to Jews, and 2 years later they figured out that the whole thing was making fun of them, and they had public book burnings of it. But listen what he wrote. An example of one piece. So I wrote, don't be like your ancestors who believed in God's simple oneness alone and declared him free of any multiplicity, and mistakenly understood when the verse says, Hear, O Israel, Hashem your God, Hashem is one, to be saying that Hashem is in fact one, rather than a combination or group. You're not like this. Believe in him as both one and three. There's one and there's three. Not a three of combination, but an essential combination back to back. Something that a mouth cannot ever explain, and something impossible to be understood by human reason. Nothing should be added or removed from this. So it's piece after piece that makes an absolute mockery of Christianity that they were publishing from him.
His motive was to get Yidden back with this?
I think he had a sense of humor. And I do think he wanted to support the Jews and make people, give people courage and strength and whatever. I also think he was just a character, because it's hysterical when you read it, understanding the history that went behind it.
Also, there's great danger doing that.
Enormous courage that it took to write
When did
such
he
a.
publish this? In Spain?
In Spain. In the end of his life, he decided he's going to move to Israel. Listen to just what this was like. So he decides at the end of his life to emigrate to Israel. He took along his friend. His friend was David Bongiorno. That's the guy's
When
name.
you say friend, who do you mean, like his friend?
And when they reached Avignon, they got there, they met up with Paul of Burgos, who you can Google. He was a Jew who had renounced Judaism to become a bishop in favor of Christianity. And he successfully convinced the Bongiorno guy, who was going with one of the Rishonim to move to Israel. He convinced him instead to adopt Christianity, which he did. He got him back. And therefore, Reprofria Duran,
His buddy was
three
a
Jews.
I got lost.
Every Jew in those days had been baptized and converted to Christianity.
In Spain.
It's very important to understand that in Ashkenaz, they would give you the choice of either convert or die. And you have a lot of stories of the Jews consistently being willing to die. In Spain, they often did not give you that choice. They would physically take you and convert you and baptize you. Now, you weren't saying, I agree. You were kicking and screaming, but now you're a Christian. Once you're a Christian, the Inquisition means they're questioning you. They only had control over Christians. Inquisition had no control over if someone is not a Christian, but they'll be like, boom, okay, poof, you're a Christian. Now you're an irresponsible Christian. So it was a very interesting thing how this kind of thing happened. But he was a famous example of someone who was a real Baal Teshuva. I mean, he was raised by parents and with people without Jewish practice, without Jewish things, and he wound up writing this amazing sefer, which I highly recommend. You can find it on, on Otzar Chachma, or probably on Hebrew books, and it's wild. Okay. So now, there's a story with the Anusim. The biggest subject after the Karaites was when in the 1600s and 1700s people started showing up in other countries, who were real Baal Teshuva, who had been living as Christians. How does this work? So there was a story that Rav Moshe Chagiz lived in Israel as a child. He was born in the early 1600s, and then eventually he moved to Europe. But in his childhood, he says he heard a story from an old man who had been in Tzfat at this time, when somebody showed up in the life of the Arizal. And this has become a somewhat famous story in the last 5-10 years about the person with the challahs. Did you ever hear this? This guy showed up from Portugal in the times of the Arizal, so it's not that long after. It's a 1492, right? And he heard the rabbi giving a drasha about the lechem hapanim and how important this was. So he goes up to his wife and he says, you got to bake some bread, and I'm going to bring it to the shul and put it in front of the thing and make an offering to God. Famous story. And he would do this every week, and now the shamish would come before Shabbos to clean up and find these piping hot loaves of bread, and he would just scarf them down. So now these little achmaniyot, whatever it was. So now the rabbi shows up like a year later, and every week, this is tzfas. So you understand, this guy's come, he's dancing his way in. Hashem, please accept these things. He comes home to his wife after davening every week and says, God accepted and ate our loaves of bread. He's happy with us. And in the meantime, the rabbi's coming one week after some time to prepare his drasha, and he comes in, and then this guy, again, it's tzfas. The guy has no idea the rabbi walked in. He's dancing before the Aron. Hashem, please accept my thing. And the rabbi says, excuse me, what's happening in my shul? He says, I'm bringing an offering to God. He says, so you're a pagan, right? So what are you doing? I mean, he says, we don't believe in this. This is the antithesis of all Judaism. He says, how dare you bring, right, like a korban to God, and you think God's eating it? He says, get the shamash in here. And he says, the shamash, hodav alavosh, he admitted, he sheepishly said, I have been eating them. I didn't know where they were coming from, but I get a little peckish on Friday. My wife doesn't cook until you have to wait for Shabbat. Whatever. In the end, he, right? In the end, this, as the rabbi is berating this man for basically avodah zarah, right? The Arizal's gabbai comes in the room, tells him and says, listen, the Rebbe wants to talk to you. So the rabbi says to the rabbi, the rabbi shows up. The reason he says, you need to go home and get your affairs in order. You're not giving the dresser tomorrow. You will be dead by then. So he says, what happened? He says, from the day that Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, Hashem did not have so much pleasure as he did from this man and his wife sincerely preparing these loaves. And you took that pleasure away from Hashem and you're going to die.
But the rabbi's right.
Right, so it's amazing. In other words, you see, first of all, what it says over here, that when Anusim come back, you need to be extra gentle. This man's pure heart, Hashem really values. A person who sincerely is trying to do it, even if you get it wrong, and there are explicit sources, the Ravid and others seem to say this.
Why does this have to do with the
So
first?
He was in one of the Anusim, yeah, so he had no Jewish background enough to know the basics of Judaism. And he was from Portugal, and he came to the Upper Galilee, and this was like his story. It's used by, this is from the 1600s, so it's a very early source. There's a Radvaz, there's a few other sources that say explicitly that if a person really is trying to do the right thing with all of their heart, and they get the wrong things, even in a matter of apikourses, that there's forgiveness for such a thing. Hashem is pleased with such a thing.
He was too harsh, not that he told him the truth.
Right. The way he handled this, it seems, should have been in a way that keeps the person's passion and things alive and gets into the and indeed, the next day he passed away, and that's how the story ends in the Sefer Mishnas Chasidim, which was published by Moshe Chagiz in the 1600s. So it's like a very, very interesting story that talks about this. Now, the Ber Hativ then says something very interesting, and this is wild. He wants to know if the Anusim, even if they have a Jewish mother, he says it's not clear. The Ber Hativ in Shulchan Aruch and Even Ezer Siman Daled says, it says in Shulchan Aruch that if your father is Jewish, your mother's not, you're not Jewish. But if your mother's Jewish and your father's not, you are Jewish. And he says, but I'm not sure about the Moranos. Not sure. And the question is, wait a minute, why not? There are some Rishonim, this is worth knowing. There are some Rishonim who are of the following opinion. If a person converts fully to another religion and gets assimilated to the point that he's no longer Jewish in any way, that he's a goy. And if he would marry someone, it's not a marriage. And if he divorced someone, this is nothing. And his wife wouldn't need a divorce. His wife wouldn't need chalitza or yibum. There's a Mordechai. And there's possibly a Pirush HaMishnayos in the Rambam, according to some. And there's a Meiri who says, some of his Rabbosai said this, that it's not just assimilation. It seems they all are talking about converting to another religion. And the Mordechai says, what about the fact that if a mummer to another religion is Makadesh, a woman, she's considered Mekudesh. She says that because we're worried maybe the person had thoughts of tshuva. The minute they do tshuva, they're back into being Jewish. But until they do the tshuva, they're not. Rav Moshe Feinstein says what Rabbi Solomon is thinking. This is the most bizarre thing I've ever heard in my life. It must have been somebody, this must be a typo. I'm sure no Rishonim ever said it. Can't be. It's very strange. On the other hand, Soloveitchik from YU would quote that Reb Chaim Brisker held this way, his grandfather. Now, he consistently has access to opinions of Reb Chaim that Reb Chaim's own children and other people did not seem to think Reb Chaim said. They claim he's mistaken or something, oftentimes. This is one of those, it seems. On the other hand, he really said it. Soloveitchik would explain it. It's in the Shiurim of his Nedarim. And the idea is that a person, if you had someone today from the Spanish Inquisition who we could prove their mother's mother was Jewish, halachically they're not Jewish, although it might be a lot easier for them to jump back in. It's hard to forget if they need a full conversion or what the story was. Maybe only the first generation needs a conversion. It's actually really practical. Right now, Marano's people are showing up on a daily basis saying, my mother's, right, they're claiming they know for sure that they are from Jewish stock.
You can't prove it, obviously.
So but let's say they were right. According to this, they're still not Jewish. Additionally, if somebody is raised by Christian parents, or their mother goes off the derech or something, and their uncles are all Jewish, like we know they're Jewish, but this kid is raised from birth as a Christian, among Christians, going to church, going to everything else, according to these minority opinions, they would need a conversion, those children.
So Esau died a goy?
According to these opinions, maybe. And Rabbi Meiselman, who's Rav Soloveitchik's nephew, Rosh Yeshiva Torah Moshe, is quoted in this sefer, in Semen Yod Zayin by Rabbi Fried, as saying that he thinks we should be choshesh for this. Well, there's enough Rishonim, and his uncle said that Reb Chaim said this. He thinks that we should be choshesh. It's a fascinating position. The Brisker Rav himself in his comments on Chumash, the Brisker Rebbe is the son of Reb Chaim, says that when Mashiach comes, there will be people that didn't even know they were Jewish, and it turns out they're Kahanim.
No, for sure.
He says that. And so he said, and they'll be real Kahanim because they wind up being Jewish, and they don't even realize.
A woman not having
Right.
a daughter.
And if you think about the Spanish Inquisition, you think about it was half the Jews were forcibly converted. Half. So if the average birth rate, right, if you assume people just replace themselves with 2 children and one is a girl each time, there should be just as many. And if there was any more, if the average was 3, forget about it. These numbers get astronomical. You know that thing where you double the penny each day for a month? I mean, it's like ridiculous. So it's a machlokas, really. Are these people... Now, where does this come from? The Gemara says there was a group of people called the Kusim. Yeah?
Can you squish the pin the way in? Is this the idea? You can actually just
Correct. Is there a way? Right. Is there a way to get rid of your Judaism? So there are a couple interesting things that do apply to this. The Kusim, the Gemara says, were a group of people who converted to Judaism, and according to the opinion that they were Gerei Emes, they were legitimate conversions. There's then a Gemara that says that the Chachamim made them like Goyim for all things. So some people understand that means they made gezeras on them. Their wine we treat like Goyish wine. Right? They don't marry them, all different things, because of how they were behaving, and it was like time to separate from them. However, some of these Rishonim learned that the Chachamim have the capacity to make somebody not a Jew, and the Chasam Sofer says this. I think he was talking about the Reformers, but in Siman Lamed Tes of Orach Chaim, on the laws of Tefillin, the Chasam Sofer says that the Chachamim have the power at any time to declare somebody a non-Jew, and then that becomes their identity. That becomes the identity lahalacha, even for things like marriage and divorce, even the chumrah. That's the chacham have such a power, and he's bringing the story of the kusim. So that's an interesting source. His student, the Maram Shik, says it both ways. He says also when it comes to converting someone to Judaism, the chacham can declare somebody Jewish or not. That's part of the system. Am Yisrael is defined by the Sanhedrin or whoever that is, and they can declare somebody yes part of it or not part of it. Rabbi Moshe Tandler, my grandfather, at one time when I met him in Israel, we were visiting him. We went to meet up with him in one of the cousins' houses, and he was visiting, and he opens up this. He was the first person to show me this Chasam Sofer in Shulchan Aruch, and he says he was so frustrated with some of the people that were in the left wings of barely clinging to orthodoxy. I don't know if it's open or who, I don't know. And he's like, I think the time may have come to declare these people like he was so frustrated to use this Chasam Sofer to just say they're not Jews anymore. And that's I think that was his way of expressing frustration. I don't think he really was suggesting creating a Sanhedrin. And
Is there no? Well, I can say this for the end because it's going to take a minute. But the question is about the opposite because it's pretty common today. You have people that in no way are Jewish but are being raised either
right. So
really connected.
In theory, if the appropriately authorized superior Bezdin or Chazal in the Gemara said in such a situation, then perhaps there would be a way to make someone Jewish or not, just with such a decree. But it doesn't work with like a regular. We wouldn't say that your average person on a basis. This is not how we posture anyway. That a regular basis that says, okay, yeah, you're Jewish, even though because for $10,000, we can probably make something happen this Saturday, this Sunday. And unfortunately, such things do happen. That's not real. Like that isn't real. Halacha says it's not real. Okay, even that Maram Shik is a chiddush, but okay, that would be one of the big sources for this. Now, what else we got? A lot of interesting things. So this was Soloveitchik's, that whole thing. But then there's a story from the Vilna Gaon. There's a very, very famous story from the Vilna Gaon, which is published in the Keser Rosh. Keser Rosh is one of the pretty reliable things. It was written by Reb Chaim Volozhiner, and he says the Vilna Gaon was, for some reason, learning Torah. I guess he must have been traveling or something, but he wound up in some kind of a, krechma, some kind of an inn or something, where people could order drinks. And some totally secular Jew, totally not religious Jew, comes in and says, I'll have a drink, and he's about to drink it. The Vilna Gaon says, you have to make a bracha. So the guy says, I do every Aveira in the whole world. I'm not religious at all. What do you bother me for? And he said, you don't get away with anything by saying I'm not religious. You still have to make every single bracha and every single thing. Just saying I'm not religious doesn't get you off the hook for even one bracha. And you have to know that even if on every other thing you're not doing, it's still worth doing this because this is your responsibility. It's like a whole thing that the Gemara said to him. So some people want to say,
And he put tefillin on people for 100%. I believe that.
right, and then he
People
put
are
tefillin on,
Shabbos,
and then,
tefillin today, it makes
and then
perfect
apparently he
sense.
was seen going, yeah. Right? Apparently that's one school of thought. Right?
If you're a secular Jew and say, I love you, I want to help you make a bracha.
At least this bracha.
Right, which means did it 1,000 other times in his life.
So basically, all the Hasidim that go out doing this are really.
Because of the graph.
That's right. They're basically Litvaks, and it's just. But you see this. I always say that since I was young, the more that I learn, the less I'm able to tell what's a Hasidic thing and what's a Litvish. Like, they're so much more similar in the Torah and in the things. Like, I once gave Rabbi Solomon a sefer called Pnina Mishulchan Agra. It's the most Hasidic Torah. Right? I mean, it's like everything in there could have been said by a Rebbe. This gematria and that thing and that, like, it's one Torah. I mean, we're not so far off. But anyway, that story from the Gra is fascinating. The only thing is, and it sounds like the opposite again of this idea. The only argument I guess someone could make is in that story it doesn't say the person had converted to another religion. He was just a mummer, not mishtamed, and perhaps that's a distinction that could be made. Okay, now another interesting thing is this. There's a story of Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. This is the famous, when you go back to the Gemara.
Did he make the bracha or we don't know? I'm just curious.
It doesn't say. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
It doesn't say, yeah. When you go back to the question is, are we going to make brachas? Are people going to now say a bracha?
I hope so.
You understand what I'm saying? Are we going to remember to say Alamichi at the end of it?
Do you know that at the end of every single Farbrengen, we're talking about thousands of extremely observant Orthodox people. The Rebbe always said, those who have to make a bracha achronim will surely make a bracha achronim. In Yiddish.
Wow.
In Yiddish. So you're talking to a Yiddish
Yeah, we should
speaking
start
crowd.
at Kiddush and Shul. I always think like maybe someone should get up and make one out loud.
The Rebbe says it's not
But I don't want people to think it's over, so I don't know how to, I do it at the end, there's no one left. Lupe won't even say amen. She's cleaning up,
I'm just saying.
No, you're right though, because when you start benching,
That's the end, so you have to think about
You know what kills every bringing and every fun gap? Myers?
Also,
what a buzzkill. I came here for spiritual inspiration, not
Talk
this.
to the Lord now.
Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. There was a guy named Reish Lakish, which is a very unusual name. We'll get to that in a second. What kind of name is Reish Lakish? It's a nickname? Shimon ben Lakish, that's his name.
I'm still working on Reb Papa. I'm saying
But what's Reish? His name is Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. We don't find people having abbreviated names.
Rashbi.
Billy, right. Rashbi is just Reb Shem Bar Yochai. We're reading it up. But this is Reish Yud Shin. And sometimes it's Reish Lakish. Reish Yud Shin, like the head. Okay, so what's interesting is that Reish Lakish was a bandit who was involved in it sounds like murderous activity. That's what bandits did. And Reish Lakish sees this magnificent beauty swimming in the water. So he goes and rips his clothes off and dives in because he takes what he likes. And he gets in there and he sees that it's Rabbi Yochanan, who didn't have a beard and was gorgeous, and he says, Shofreich Lanashi, your beauty really should be for women. It's a total waste. To which Rabbi Yochanan said, Chel Chol
not that there's
L'Oraisa.
anything wrong with that.
Your strength should really be used for Torah. And then Rabbi Yochanan said to him, he says, you know what we do? We're going down the street and we see like some kid who's like not so religious, and he's smoking a cigarette on Shabbos, and we think like, oh, a bum, right? This guy was worse than that kid. There's always worse. And Rabbi Yochanan says I'll tell you what, if you will promise to use your energy to study Torah, I have a sister who's more beautiful than me, and I promise you that I'll make her marry you. So he sees this kid on the street, and he thinks, you know what courage it takes when your family believes one thing in your own community to go out there and smoke a cigarette on Shabbos? You know how hard that must be? Here's how we can use that exact midah, and he gambles his own sister. He's that sure. If you're ever that sure about somebody, I'm telling you, you're going to make them from. So he goes, and there's, by the way, just before we continue, there's this famous story that Sarb Shimshon Pincus brings, and others, of this guy who had a nursing home. And he had one Jew, it's a rural nursing home somewhere, and he's serving non-kosher food to the people. And one Jewish lady signs up for the nursing home, Norma, Rosenberg. So there's a Jewish lady. So he goes to his Rav, what do I do? And they say, you cannot feed her non-kosher food. So he says, okay. So he starts giving her airline meals. And she's completely not satisfied with this. She says no. So he goes back to his Rav, and he's like, okay, so make the whole place kosher. I don't know why whatever. You need to make the whole place. I can't make the whole place kosher. That's going to cost me $50,000 a week, to change that thing. And he says, you cannot feed this woman not kosher. The woman's putting up a stink and she's making an issue. And so he went down and spent a week there. and convinced the woman to start keeping kosher, right? And she became firmer, right? So they said to him, how did you do it? He said, I had no choice. It was going to cost me $2,000 a month. I had no choice. So Rabbi Pinkus says, I understand, if you ever feel responsible, like you're on the hook, you could do it in a week. So the point is, like, maybe we don't always care enough. Yeah, Rabbi Yochanan was in. He was 100% in on this. So my sister's going to marry you. It's going to be good. And Reish Lakish made a firm commitment at that point and became from. Reish Lakish was an adult. He was an adult of marriageable age who was already a bandit. He was a leader of the bandits. And him and Rabbi Yochanan became chavrusas. They learned together. And they were brothers-in-law and the dearest of friends. And one time Rabbi Yochanan said something rude to Reish Lakish. This is the main Rabbi Yochanan of Shas. This is Rabbi Yochanan. And Rabbi Yochanan said to Reish Lakish, they were arguing about something in learning, and they were talking about swords and when it becomes a kli. And Reish Lakish had a different opinion than Rabbi Yochanan. He says, okay, I guess you know about the weapons, you know.
Oh, God.
You know, bandits know about weapons. Who doesn't know?
So uncomfortable.
And Reish Lakish was terribly, terribly hurt by this. They disagreed with each other about this. You're not allowed to mention to a Baal Teshuva, Zechor. And Rav Yochanan, for some reason, whatever he said, really got to Reish Lakish. And it got to the point that they got in an argument, and Reish Lakish said to him, if that's the case, what did I even ever become religious for? If that's how you see this, which is unbelievable, he says, but all the Torah, all the things, Rav Yochanan was so hurt by that he was very mad at him, to the point that Reish Lakish started getting sick and dying. And the wife, Rav Yochanan's sister, comes and begged, and Rav Yochanan was like, I'm sorry, like I can't, there's nothing I can do, and Reish Lakish died. And tragically. And then Rabbi Yochanan was so sad. He would walk through the streets and cry and cry and said, Heichat Bar Lakisha. Where are you, Bar Lakisha? So that is not an Israeli, right,
Israeli,
girl.
I wasn't thinking Israeli.
Bar, right? Like Bar Raffaeli and then Lakisha, right? Which is also interesting. You don't generally find people whose name was, who had a name, adding an aleph on the end. Like, it's interesting. Bar Lakisha. And it means son of Lakish, Ben Lakish. Where are you? Where are you? He says, my whole life was, is meaningless. Like, without you, I would learn Torah and you would ask, right? Where are you, my chavrusa, my friend? And he was slowly losing his mind. They brought him another person to learn with him, Rabbi Elazar ben Pedas, who was really sharp. And whenever Rabbi Yochanan would say something, Rabbi Elazar would say, oh, and I can find a proof to what you just said. He's like, I know that I'm saying a good thing. Reish Lakish asked me 24 questions and everything I said, and that made me able to learn. And Rabbi Yochanan had lost 10 children who all died. And he would carry around a little tiny bone of the last one. It was too small to be Mekabel Tumah, to give other people chizik. He was able to handle anything, but not the death of Reish Lakish. He walked in the streets until he lost his mind, and the Rabbanan davened for him that he should die, and Rabbi Yochanan died. Like an extremely tragic ending to this Bav Metzia.
We could for sure do this on Tisha B'Av. This is sad.
It's an unreal story.
Which parak?
It's in the pace. It's in the Bav Metzia.
He insulted the Reish Lakish, but he could have.
So he insulted him, but in other words, and then Reish Lakish insults him. So it seems clear to me the following thing: Rabbi Yochanan is like Yosef HaTzadik in many, many places. He was considered. He looked like Yosef. He says, I'm a descendant of Yosef. The women would all look at him when they came out of the mikvahs that their children should be tzaddik, and he would sit and learn somewhere where he couldn't see them, it seems, but they could walk out and see him. And he had such a beauty, like Yosef's beauty, and there's all different connections between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish was much more the Baal Teshuva type, which is like from the Yehuda, right? In fact, what's the name Reish Lakish? So one theory from Reuben Margolius is that he was the city of Lakish. There was a city called Lakish. And there's Rabbi Yehuda bar Lakish and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, but at one point he was the head of this city, and he was Reish Lakish, the head of Lakish. However, I'll tell you one thing. Reish Lakish's name, you know Yoreh Malkosh in the Shema? Malkosh is the late rains, and the Targum of Malkosh is Lakisha. So that's the Targum, right? It's a beautiful Jewish name that means late rains. Yeah, it's a Geshmaka name. Lakisha. Lamed Kuf Yud Shin Aleph. That's how you'll spell it in the Ksuba. That's Hashem, listen, somebody told me the other day, somebody sent me a thing of an African-American comic saying, like, why are you Jews naming all your holidays after black women? Do you see this? He's like, I know at least 5 Rosh Hashanahs. What are you naming them? That was Yeah, it's a good line. So we name our Tana. They name after our Tana. So the question is what? So things that come late. Rav Yochanan, right, was born saved from. He was beautiful, like Yosef, whose big advantage is getting out of the house without sinning. Yosef is not from the Yehuda side where they make mistakes and they like he's from the Yosef side, from the Rachel side. So Reish Lakish, however, comes late. In other words, even the beginning, Reish Lakish means the beginning, came late. I'll explain a little more. But I think that's a compelling argument because listen to this Medrash. The Medrash says, Akev, that Abraham listened to my voice. Rabbi Yochanan says...
In that case, he was branded as the guy. They called him Baal Teshuva, right? That was his name.
Reish Lakish,
yeah,
right.
You're Baal Teshuva, right?
Right. And seeing that Rav Yochanan, it seems to me, that seeing that Rav Yochanan seemed to not respect, when he felt that it was not respected, he says, why did I do this whole thing? In other words, what do you mean why did I do this whole thing? Because it wasn't just about learning Torah from here forward. It was about making my time as a bandit into a meaningful time. You turn your Averas into mitzvahs. You use your experiences. Rabbi Yochanan says Avram discovered God at 48. And Reish Lakish says at 3 years old. Because Akev is Ayin Kuf Beis. It's 172 years. Right? That Avram worshipped Hashem because he lived to 175. Akev, for 172 of them, he worshipped Hashem. Says the Kesef Mishnah, author of the Shulchan Aruch, that there's a Hagos Maimonides from Kushta, whatever. There's an earlier work that explains that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish aren't really arguing. They're just describing different timelines. His journey started at 3. But the Rambam says Rambam writes in the laws of Avodah Zarah that Avram was still worshiping idols with his family as a teenager. Right? Now at 48 years old is when he finished. So Rabbi Yochanan says at 48 he started serving Hashem. Because Rabbi Yochanan is the tzaddik gamur. And Reish Lakish says, no, you don't understand. From 3 years old, those were productive years. They became productive at 48. But when you look back in time, that's a machlokas Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, which is an amazing observation. And once we say that, so now you understand, Reish Lakish, his beginning became meaningful based upon his end. It's a beautiful suggestion to how we understand his name, I think, if I do say so myself. But I want to say, I also get to say Lakisha a lot of times, so it's a vart that I like to say. And also Malika. I also like learning about Malika, which is, okay. What's
Malika?
It's when you sever the bird's head, Malika, with a kuf, whatever. Okay, so now, it could be that was the Reish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan interaction, of Reish Lakish was sort of insisting upon a certain worldview that wasn't exactly Rabbi Yochanan's worldview. They were two very different people who managed to get along, and in the end, their demise is fascinating. But you do learn from there how sensitive you have to be with somebody's past. That it could really be disastrous, even for righteous, holy people. It could be very hurtful. So don't tell about Teshuva. Remember what you used to do. And the Gemara says, because after all, a person has a relative, this is the Gemara's language, man de zakif le zakifa, somebody who had a relative who was hung for their crimes, will not say to their slave or their child, can you hang up this fish for me? So people would hang a fish, like you might hang up a salami, to dry or whatever, and he won't even use the word hanging. And therefore the Gemara says that mumsha b'cha al tama lechavercha, don't say your sin to your friend, because if somebody who hangs up a fish, there's another Gemara that says, don't tell about Teshuva to remember what he did. The Kesef Mishnah brings those two together. It's interesting. So you have to be careful not to knock someone else for something that you have yourself, because it shows you don't care about that.
Is it okay for Baal Teshuva to constantly bring up their past?
We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that actually right now. Yeah, that's all they ever talk about. Is like oftentimes also you have this attitude, and it's gonna come up with this. We're getting close to the end of this, so we have another 12 minutes or so if you're antsy or you need the ladies' men's room. Almanashani tzadik gomur. Person goes to a woman and says, "Marry me on condition that I'm entirely righteous." How many tzaddik gomors are there to begin with? And the guy comes to the woman, and he's known to be a rasha. So this guy just finishes robbing a bank. He's chewing on a ham sandwich. He swallows it down and goes over to the woman, gets down on bended knee, and says, "Harei mikudeshesli," on condition that I'm a tzaddik gomer. She says, "Absolutely." Sticks out her finger and takes the ring. So the Gemara says it's a mikudeshes, which we learn means it's a suffix. We have to treat it as if maybe they're married, because maybe he had thoughts of tshuva in his heart. You learn from here the difference between you right now, going from whoever you are to tzaddik gamur. You don't have to do vidui. You don't have to do all the steps of tshuva. You can do it tomorrow. Just the decision to be a tzaddik gomer from here on, to have hirur tshuva, in sincere thoughts of tshuva, is all that it takes.
So why is Yom Kippur service is so long?
Right, because it's very hard to inspire those thoughts. Right? And it's very difficult. And there's also a mitzvah of tshuva on Yom Kippur, and tshuva includes vidui and charata and kabbalah la'asid and so on. Okay, so now listen to this. There's a problem. Yeah, there's a problem. Because there's another Gemara that says, Rabbi Abahu says, Rabbi Yochanan's position is, Rabbi Yochanan says, a tzaddik gomer is better than a Baal Teshuva. But Rabbi Abahu says, b'makom shabali tshuva omdim, tzaddikim gemurim ein yicholam. So it's this, our same Rabbi Yochanan has the position that if you're a tzaddik gomer, you get much greater reward than if you were a Baal Teshuva. And Rabbi Abahu shows up and says, no, Baal Teshuva can reach places that no tzaddik can reach.
That's not exactly what he says, though.
The makom shabali tshuva omdim.
It's very ambiguous.
Yes, so there are different mafarshim who try to get into it.
What's his name? Just
Al Tiyah Gavosech.
What's your position?
Yes, I don't think that there's any. It's absolutely clear from the context of the Gemara that they're disagreeing. It says pligad Reb Abahu, so they're disagreeing in terms of who's at a higher level. The what? Because it doesn't. It says b'makom shabali tshuva to the point that some people learn it's actually better to be a tzaddik gomer, but the Baal Teshuva can do certain things. That tzaddik. There are people who want to fiddle with it. The Rambam says though, the Rambam does not bring it that way. He brings it very clearly. He's very explicit, and he says the following. Al yidme adam Baal Teshuva shehu meruchat mimalas tzaddikim. A Baal Teshuva shouldn't think that he's far away. You have a guy sat in yeshiva, right? From 6 years old, he was learning Torah, right? And he goes to yeshiva. He spends his lifetime avoiding all these things. And you have a guy who's running around, and at 50 years old, he decides, I'm going to get my act together. He should not think he's far from the Reb Chaim Kanievskis and the Lubavitch Rebbes and the big tzaddikim. He's not. It's not true. He's absolutely beloved, as if he never sinned at all. That's not all. Scharo harbe, he gets enormous reward because he tasted the taste of sin and he stays away from it. Once you've eaten those foods and tried those things, it's much harder to stay away from it. It's much, much harder. The Kavash Yitzro, and he's controlling his Yitzhar. Amrucham Makam Shabali Shuam, the Ein Tzadikim Muricham Lava. Now the problem is, when you have Rabbi Abahu and Rabbi Yochanan, you pass like Rabbi Yochanan. The halach is like Rabbi Yochanan. Right? We generally rule like Rabbi Yochanan over Reish Lakish. Certainly over Rabbi Abahu, we would rule like Rabbi Yochanan. So the problem is, why does the Rambam say this? Says the Rugged Shavar. And I also found it in the Tyrus Menachem from the Lubavitch Rebbe, not quoting the Rugged Shavar. So it could be, he would quote him. He quotes him all the time. So it could be that he heard it from him and didn't remember 50 years before or something, or he saw it. Or it could be that since this is one of his Rabbeim, that he learned how to think like him. And they're both mechavid. But they say like this. You know why? The Rambam would rule like Rav Yochanan or Rabbi Abahu. But when there's another Gemara that shows that the Stam Gemara rules like the other one, so it's 2 against 1. Yachid Rabbi Lach Rabbi. Where do you see this? Because if a man goes to a woman and says, marry me on condition that I'm a tzaddik gomer, and you know he did Averis today, he's definitely not a tzaddik gomer, he's a Baal Teshuva. Now Baal Teshuva is less than a tzaddik gomer. So that shouldn't work. Clearly, the Gemara is assuming a Baal Teshuva is even superior. It's tzaddik gomer plus, like the Rambam says. If that's the case, then that Gemara is the source to say that a Baal Teshuva is even superior. And therefore, that's why he ruled like this. Now, there's another interesting question. Another very interesting question. What about the fact that the Gemara says if a man goes to a woman and says, marry me on condition that I am poor, and he turns out to be rich. So Gemara says that that's okay. But if he says, marry me on condition that I'm Israel, it turns out to be a Kohen, Shvach Yuchsin, the Gemara says it's not a marriage. And Rashi explains, because when it comes to saying that you're better, maybe she doesn't want, the person's going to be all arrogant. That's what Rashi says. He's worried that right? So a woman will say, I can marry Yisrael. I can marry a convert. I can't marry a Kohen. He's going to walk around. His whole family thinks they're better than me. I'm going to try to show up in my clothes, dressed on their Pesach program. You're kidding, right? They can't handle this. Whereas if the husband happens to have more money, that's okay. But yichus, no way. So nowadays it's all about money. It's not about yichus, right? So I don't know if it would change nowadays. If you say, I can't handle a rich family like that, because it could be that when it's money you'll handle anything. But that's the halacha, right? Isn't that interesting? So now the question asked by the Shar Yisachar and many others is, wait a minute. If a person says, I'm a tzaddik gomer, and a Baal Teshuva is better, it shouldn't be good. It's like Kohen, and you said you're Yisrael. If it has to be identical. If it's better, then we know that when it comes to like these sort of things, answers the Imrei Emes. He says, the Rambam describes what is a Baal Teshuva. And he says, Baal Teshuva darkan lihiyos shvalim ve'anavim b'yosef. The way of a Baal Teshuva is to be exceedingly humble, right? And shafel, to keep yourself low profile. Im charfu osan haksilim, if foolish people make fun of them, for b'masayim harishonim, with the things that they did earlier, yeah, yesterday you were a chazer fresser, now you're going to tell me to be quiet in shul, right? Al yargishu lehem, they should pay no attention. They don't pay attention. A Baal Teshuva doesn't listen to that. El shomin usmechim, they listen to this with great joy, and they know that that's their big schus. Being embarrassed by this clown is your greatest schus, because every time avru v'nichlomim mehen zlusam baruba, every minute they stand there being embarrassed by this guy, their merit grows. And it's a terrible sin to say this to Baal Teshuva. Don't ever say that. But when a Baal Teshuva hears that, he's thrilled. If you're a true Baal Teshuva, you're so humble. So says the Imrei Emes, since that's the case, if the guy's actually a Baal Teshuva, the greater than the Tzaddik Gamur, he's not going to be lording it over his wife. And therefore, you don't have to worry about that. A woman is happy to marry a Baal Teshuva over a Tzaddik Gamur because a true Baal Teshuva is very humble. And I'll tell you something else about this from Rav Moshe Feinstein.
Why can't Rish Lakish follow that?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It's hard to believe that it was because of this. Maybe because he was the proponent of this basic ideology that, no, in other words, there is value to this. Makam Shabbat Tshuva Omdim. And it almost seemed like Rabbi Yochanan was questioning. He didn't believe that. As you see from the Gemara in Brachos, right? Rabbi Yochanan says, no, that's how the Gemara is superior.
But for Rish Lakish to accept that gives him the extra scope,
it's a
right?
mysterious... Correct. It's a very mysterious thing. I was thinking about, as I'm reading it, was Rish Lakish acting with a lack of humility? Perhaps. It's hard to say.
Maybe.
For both of them, it seems clear that life was no longer meaningful anymore. In other words, Rav Yochanan lost 10 children. I mean, that's horrible. But you know what? He believes in Olam Haba. And Rav Yochanan knows that there's meaning to life. And Rav Yochanan, there's a famous thing where Rav Yochanan said, Ki hayem suffered the Eov. When he would finish teaching the book of Eov, he would say, Sof Adam Lamisa, Sof Behema L'Shchita. People all wind up dying, and every animal is getting slaughtered, right? Ashrei mi. So that's when you're alive. Fortunate is the person she'amal b'torah, v'govlu b'torah, right? V'govlu b'shem tov, v'osanachas ruach liyotzo. He says, but at least the person can, when they're alive, at least learn some Torah. That's what Yochanan used to say. So now the question is, so first of all, some people say when he finished the book of Eov means his own life was the book of Eov. 10 children, and they, when he finished living through these things, as we would say. Some people like to say that. It's a Drushi thing to say. But the question is, what do you mean sof behema l'shchita? It's not true. Most animals in the world just die, dogs and cats. So it sounds like he was saying like this. An animal has a meaningful purpose in this life. Everyone dies, but animal can get shchita, right? You can have a cow that you slaughter, and then it goes for something. You use the Sefer Torah with the skin, and you take the animal for that, right? And you eat the food. But a human being, what purpose is there to a human being with all this suffering? The answer was Torah and attaching to God and living a meaningful life. The minute that he didn't have his chavrusa anymore, and he couldn't get clarity in his learning, because Rav Chashmaitza, when he had Rish Lakish to ask him 24 questions, it built him up so much, and now he was mediocre in his learning. He couldn't get anywhere like he used to be able to. So he lost his mind. Now they davened for him to die. Why didn't they daven for him to get his mind back? Because the minute he would have gotten it back, he would have lost it again. Because he didn't have, you understand? Because he didn't have what for him was life itself. Pain is something people can deal with, but not, he couldn't deal with an absence of life. It's right. In other words, once his learning wasn't available. So it's an interesting thing. In other words, what he died from, that's what Mepharshim talk about. Now, my father-in-law, Rabbi Tendler, was buyer of Moshe Feinstein for many years, and there's 4 volumes that have come out called Masoras Moshe. Every day, he spent the whole day with Rav Moshe for a number of years. 8 years, some long time. And he wrote down every single day, everything that happened. Rav Yosef came, this one, right, what happened, who spoke to him, what they spoke about, and he wouldn't go to sleep until he wrote everything down. And a few years back, some Gerech Hasidim of Rav Shol Alter, Rav Shiva, called him up and said, we're looking for things about the Pnei Menachem when he met Rav Moshe. Do you have any memories? He said, I don't have memories so clear, but I have actual notebooks. If you tell me what years, I can find for you exactly what happened, what time of day he came, what they spoke about. So they said, okay, it was between this and that, and he looked around and he found it for them. He called them back. They said, wait a minute, what is this? So they came down and they saw his notebooks, and they told Rav Shaul Alter and Rav David Cohen, different people, and they said, you have to publish this. So they raised some money on their own, and they started putting them out. So 4 volumes have already come out, but there's some stuff that doesn't go in. If anyone wants to come to my house, without any recording equipment and without any cameras, I'll show you some of the hashmatos. Those are the things that, because everything. So if Rav Moshe said, oh, that rabbi's a very difficult man, stay away from him, right? That's in there. You can't publish that. So this is Rav Shmuel first from Chicago, was a Talmud of Rav Moshe, and a colleague of my father, so sat down and edited the whole thing, went through the whole thing and said, you can't put this in, you can't put that in. Here's one of the things you can't put in.
On video.
On video.
Okay.
Yeah, meaning I wasn't told I can't put it in, the publishers are told. The Shabbaton Hashnati Shel Agudas Yisrael. It was the annual Agudah convention. Thanksgiving weekend every year. Kishizkarti l'Rabbeinu. So I mentioned to Rav Moshe how the Novominsker Rebbe's drasha. I guess Rav Moshe wasn't present for the Novominsker's drasha, and he said the Novominsker Rebbe said how it's very important for us to learn from Baal Teshuva how to yearn for Hashem. And Rav Moshe said to him, he says, it's true. He says, but nowadays Baal Teshuva are often very, very uppity. He says, Ein l'shavcham yosem midai. He says one of the basic things of tshuva is to be humble. He says a person who walks around and is so proud, I used to eat non-kosher, I used to eat this. What if a person used to be a peeping Tom? Would they walk around, right? Right, I'm paraphrasing. I'm just giving an example to make this palatable. Yes. Rav Moshe basically said that a person who's a choser b'tshuva, it's a wonderful thing, but the people that are teaching them should train them that there needs to be a certain embarrassment of your previous behavior, and you don't walk around announcing it. I used to do this and that and the next thing, but now I'm better. Because actually what it does is it fetishizes it to their children and to other people hearing it. It's like, this guy had this amazing life. Here I'm some nerdy FFB being raised in like the old city. My father was like going from college to college, on a road trip. That's not fair.
So he's saying they shouldn't turn it into
isn't that something?
career?
So no, I don't. The idea just is that what you said before, the Baal Teshuva is humble, and he's supposed to be humble, and a person is supposed to. It's a healthy thing that a person should have an attitude of, I'm not proud of the things that I tried and the things I did. It would have been better, like, if you love someone and you hurt them, or you did something wrong, your feeling is a feeling of legitimate regret, of if only I wouldn't have made those mistakes, and thank God I did learn from them, and so forth. But, so that perspective and that attitude, why didn't they publish this? Because you can't publish this, because you have to say this so carefully, and in such a careful way, and so someone's going to say, Shav in California says, okay, whatever, he's a well-known lunatic, right? You should have seen his perm spiel, right? I'm saying that's it's nothing, but here, right? Okay, so that's something else. The truth is that there's a bunch of good sources, and I'll probably skip for now, about what does it mean b'makom shebali tshuva. Let me just see if there's one or two of them that I'll share with you quickly. The tzaddik really is at a higher level, right? On the one hand, he reaches a higher level. He knows more Torah. He's more refined. He is better at certain things. A lifetime of working on your temper is better than 5 years. But that's not right. The Rambam says, but this guy gets more credit because they're not really arguing about a fact. They would both have to agree that this one gets more credit, and this one have to agree that one gets a higher level. That is the Sefer Toldos Yoshua. Okay, let me skip there's a piece in the Divrei Yoel. Rabbeinu Tam in the Sefer HaYosher says like 3 or 4 different pshatim, but one of them is Habore Yaseh B'Shul Balei Tshuva Yosem Ash Yaseh B'Shul Tzadikim. God will do for Balei Tshuva much more than he will do for tzaddikim. He says, for example, the people of Nineveh saw an incredible involvement of God that other people don't see. Why? Because Hashem wants to show Rishon how much he loves, right, the Balei Teshuva, and it's almost like otherwise people won't do tshuva, they won't believe it. And therefore, oftentimes the Baal Teshuva, the tzaddik understands God and he doesn't need this special treatment. And he gives a mashal. There was a king who had 2 slaves. One of them, he wants them both to stay loyal. But one of them is really loyal, and one of them is a chanaf, he's a brown nose. So the chanaf gets the king upset and did all these bad things. And the king got mad at him and banished him. After that, he comes back to ask for mercy for the king and falls at his feet. So the king wants him back. He wants him back. So he says, of course, I accept you. He says, now, this guy's now back. And now the king has these 2 servants, and they both come for the same favor. One of them wants his kid to get into a certain school, goes to the king and says, can you do it for me? The king says, absolutely. And then the loyal one who's always been loyal comes and asks, the king says, no, not going to do it. So he says, why? What's going on? So says Rabbeinu Tam, because this person's going to stay loyal anyway. And therefore, sometimes, right, the person who's a Baal Teshuva needs, and that's b'makom shel Baal Teshuva omdim. You can see miracles and things happening for Baal Teshuva, says Rabbeinu Tam. There's an advantage. There's a certain perspective of like, even if Hashem isn't doing the exact thing that I'm demanding of Him or asking of Him, I'm still going to stay loyal to Him. Did my life go exactly as I had planned? Maybe, maybe not, but I'm loyal to Hashem anyway. That's really, he's claiming a higher madrega, and yet, b'makom shel Baal Teshuva omdim, they will see a certain special attention from Hashem, because that's going to be what's necessary for them. That's a very interesting perspective. What else? Ramosha Almosnino. Yeah, he's a very interesting personality from Italy. So he says that the Baal Teshuva can stand in places that Tzaddik Gomer can't stand because we know that a Baal Teshuva is a person who can go back to the same place with the same woman and the same challenge and no longer give in. So Tzaddik may not be able to do it. He has to stay out of that place. And the Baal Teshuva is able to withstand. And that's what it means. B'makom shel Baal Teshuva omdim. Panim Yafo says something really interesting. Tzaddikim who stand in a pure place can't take out the holy sparks from the impure place. They can't even go there. But the Baal Teshuva, who has experience with it, can go to that place. And therefore, b'makom shel Baal Teshuva, and sometimes the Baal Teshuva, and this is very true. Sometimes you can take a person who has a past and send him to the college campus, and he can pull out holy souls that the Tzaddik Gamor won't be able to relate to necessarily. He won't connect to them. Sometimes there is really such a thing. The Trumas Hakri, who's the brother of the Tzos HaChoshen, he says also, this is similar to the Reish Lakish thing. He says the Baal Teshuva has the kochos sherachash la'atzma al yedei chatav. He has the kochos that he got when he was a sinful person. He learned all kinds of other skills and talents, and now he can use them for Kedusha, which a tzaddik can't always do. So that's a remarkably similar thing. And the last one is the kol aryeh. He really says something amazing. He says, when a Baal Teshuva does real tshuva out of love, Gemara says, that's where his averas turn into mitzvahs. Right? We didn't really talk about what that means, but his averas turn into mitzvahs. He says, but when a person does averas, they're usually doing it because they're really into it. It's really gishmak for them. Whenever you do anything with real gishmak, so then, a tzaddik in the world, ein l'shum tzaddik ba'olam. No tzaddik has ever done a mitzvah with the gishmak that a person could do an avera with. There's so much Yetzer Hara, and therefore, he says in a certain way, when they turn into Kedusha, their mitzvahs now, that came from these averas, are like filled with gishmak. It's a wild thing to say. And it's interesting. I don't know if it's true. Is it true for us that we can't do mitzvahs at that level? We do mitzvahs with a gishmak.
Yeah, and I don't think people do their
averas with so much. I know. I was thinking about this. The Beis Yisrael says that it talks about Bachure Yisrael, Shalotam Utam Chet, young Jewish boys, teenagers, who never tasted the taste of sin. So the Beis Yisrael said, it doesn't say they never sinned. People sin. They never got any gishmak out of it. Never. Even in the moment they were doing this sin, they felt so guilty, they felt so bad. Lotam Utam Chet, they never got a full taste of a chet, because that's a beautiful attitude, because a lot of us have this. We're not perfect, but we feel like human garbage when we don't do what Hashem wants from us. And that itself is wonderful. That's right, but the good kind of guilt. It's good. A person robs a bank and they feel guilt. That's good. Last thing, story. Rav Noach Weinberg used to tell this story from the Dubna Magid, right? And the story really comes from Rav the Chovos Halavavos and the Dubna Magid. And okay, he was a wealthy man. You may have heard the story before, but bear with it. He reached the age of 70 and decided to make a big celebration. He sent a letter to his 2 sons living in another country. And he said, I want you and your families to celebrate, and don't be concerned with any expenses. Anything you spend for my honor, I'll give you back 20 times. You spend $1,000, I'm giving you $20,000. $20,000, so spend. So they borrowed as much money as they could, the brother. He got the letter. Older son was a man of means. After hearing the offer, he went out and bought the nicest carriage, the nicest clothes for his children. A new shtramo and jewels for his wife. Because he knew the more he'd spend, the more he'd get back. Dressed in all their finery, they began their journey to the father's home. On the way he passed the house of his younger brother, who was a poor fellow with no money at all. Couldn't even borrow money. No one would give him credit. So his wealthy brother appeared and said, aren't you coming? He said, I have no money to rent a carriage. No problem, we'll travel with us. So the poor brother and his family climbed into the carriage and off they went to the party. Right? The grand party, the older brother approached his father and said, I spent, $300,000 to the party. So according to your offer, this is millions. My father looked at him and says, I'm not giving you a penny. Ha ha, right? He says, a deal's a deal. What are you doing? He says, I said anything you spent to honor me, I'll give you back 20 times. You didn't spend this money for my honor. You spent it for your own honor. If you were concerned about honoring me, then you would have made sure your brother had every single one of the same things. So Rav Noach Weinberg says, Rav Noach would pound his fist. It's a chil Hashem of historic proportions. How do we even raise our heads? In America alone, over 1 million Jews don't identify themselves as Jewish. You think they found these alternatives more enlightening than our Torah? Were they so ignorant of their own heritage that non-Jewish society reached out to them without a fight? We left our brothers to die. What are we going to answer to the Almighty? If you're concerned with the Almighty's honor, you need to care for His children who are spiritually impoverished. That's what Noach would say about the Teshuva movement. Yeah, and this is Eish Torah. This is Rav Noach would say. I remember him telling these type of stories. And so I would just say like this: this time of year, we're all concerned about our children, that they should be healthy, right? You should go to the right school. And there's other people who have children who really need help supporting those children. Do we care about those children, or do we just care about our own? There are people in our community, in our very community, who are really suffering financially. They're really, really struggling. And do we care about them in the way that we care about ourselves? You understand? In other words, this is a big part of why tzedakah is one of the elements of personal tshuva. Because do you care about Hashem? Do you care about, right, God's children, or do you care about yourself? And this is a very, very important thing for us to consider when it comes to the concept of tshuva, and especially this time of year. Are we focused on ourselves only, by accident, for good reasons, whatever? Or do we realize, okay, I'm trying to help my own children, but there's someone else's child who they really want to send to seminary, and they don't have the money to buy them a flight, right? They don't, one girl, they had only the money for a one-way ticket and no money for tuition and no money for, you know what I mean? And there's no shortage. I would say if you want to help anybody that's in need, you can come to me. There's people who, within our small group, where the wife is suffering from breast cancer and she was a breadwinner and now they're struggling with money and they're not telling anybody yet and they're trying to figure things. There's so many needs. Sarche Amcha Merubin, unfortunately. But you have to come to me, any rabbi and any Tomchei Shabbos, anything else. But just the idea of, I care for my own children. The minute that I extend that to anybody else, to anyone else, that I'm caring for Hashem. I don't know this other child. I don't know him. But what would I do if it was my own? Well, it's Hashem's. He cares too. And Bez Hashem, if we can adopt, maybe that's one takeaway as a real attitude. If you meet someone in the street, is it for my honor? Is it for Hashem's honor? That's an important question. Okay, Yasher Koach, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you to the Millers. Thank you for this beautiful thing. This is really nice.
Don't forget to make a...
Go ahead.
Did you finish the story with the guy going to Israel with his friend and then his friend converted?
And then he wound up having to go back. That was the tragedy. I don't know why he couldn't travel by himself. I'm not sure what that was about. I didn't. But that's